All right, again, hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation. Presentation is about how to make college accessible for students with disabilities. My name is Ryan Gale. I'm the Assistant Director of Access and Inclusion at Western Oregon University. Some of you might have already seen this. I jumped a little forward and had to back up, but I'd like to start my presentations with just a quick icebreaker. Hopefully you'll be able to catch the answer here. Hopefully you haven't seen it though. So if you do know the answer, go ahead and type it in the chat box once it pops up. I always like to use riddles, play with people's minds. So the question here on the screen says, what can be caught but never thrown? See a lot of people answering cold. Yeah, some of you might have already seen the answer. Did you grab it before I accidentally backed up? Nice work. Or illness in general, sure. Second question for the icebreaker. I start tall, but the longer I stand, the shorter I grow. What am I? Someone said age? No. I see a shadow? No. This second one seems to be more of a challenge, which is good. Someone said a pencil. Yeah, possible answer. Not the one I had in mind, but yeah, that's a good one. Snowman? No. One more? All right, I'll go ahead and show the answer. Candle. Over time, shorter and shorter. Great, nice work. During this presentation, feel free at any time in the chat box to make any comments, to make any questions. Or you can just say, I have a question in the chat box, and then I'll be able to spotlight you and pull you up so that you can, sign your question or speak your question if you'd like to do it that way. So feel free to interrupt at any time. Also, I see most of you have turned your cameras off, so then feel free to do that. And this is a very laid back, relaxed presentation. Hopefully it's very comfortable for everyone. And hopefully this also is going to encourage some discussion. During this presentation, I might be discussing about specific groups. Please do keep in mind this does not apply to all groups, but this is just based on some specific tendencies from groups. So other people from the group might have a variety of different experiences. So I'm just talking possibly generalities at some points. And I'm going to try my best to take a break about every 30 minutes. That way you can go get a drink of water, whatever you need, rest your eyes, come back fresh again. I don't want everyone's eyes to just be sitting on the screen for the entire time. This is also connected to the idea of accessibility. Now connected with COVID and the pandemic, a lot of people are struggling more than before. The office where I work in disability services, we're having a lot of people come and saying that they don't have a specific disability, but the online formatting is a lot for them and it's actually exhausting them quite frequently. So I'm hoping to alleviate some of that for us here. So for those of you who just joined, I said earlier, go ahead and turn off your video. That way it's easier for people to view the screen without too many bubbles populating it. Here's a basic rundown of what my presentation is going to look like. I'm going to do a brief introduction about myself, explain my background, talk about the role of disability services, what we expect, what we do, kind of general expectations about universities in general for disability services. Then I'm going to talk about definitions of disability. I'm going to talk about accommodations connected to all of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics. barriers, accessibility, and then provide some tips on how to make a college environment better and how to communicate with students who have a disability. So again, my name is Ryan Gale. I have a master's degree from Gallaudet University, which is in Washington, D.C. I graduated from there with a master's, focusing on international development for people with disabilities, so specifically focusing on studying people with disabilities. I grew up in Jamaica. I moved to America several years ago. In Jamaica, I often noticed differences in terms of access and also how individuals with disabilities lived. I've also lived and worked in India for another point of comparison. So I noticed people with disabilities, the deaf community, and how those communities vary depending on place. I also went in college in Pennsylvania on scholarship and got my bachelor's there. And right now I'm working at Western Oregon University in the Office of Disability Services as the assistant director. And I've been there for almost 7 years now. I've also been heavily involved in advocacy over the years. I was previously a commissioner on the Oregon Disabilities Commission. And I've done a variety of different advocacy for policy change connected to the disability community. And I've also lobbied for change in Salem, trying to require all businesses to provide captioning, make sure that captions are turned on for all media services that are being provided in public spaces. I've also advocated for sign language interpreter access. I used to serve on ORAHED as well, the Oregon Association for Higher Education and Disability Board. So different universities are involved with that organization, connected to colleges and accessibility for all over the Northwest. That is a brief summary of the experiences that I've had so far that brought me to here. When we talk about the role of higher education, we provide reasonable accommodations to make sure that students with disabilities have equal access, to make sure that they have access to the community, to the programming, and to the education. And that is supported by the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, and the American with Disabilities Act. Specifically for public universities or anywhere that does receive federal funding, they need to follow those two specific stipulations in law. Discussion also often does come up about what reasonable means as far as reasonable accommodation means. It means an accommodation that does not cause an unfair burden on the provider or university. And it does also not cause an unfair disadvantage for a student who is being provided with that accommodation. Sometimes people think that an accommodation means that everything needs to be provided no matter what for anyone's request. Other times people are very strict with that and they don't provide something that would be adequate to make that an equal opportunity, which also is not reasonable. So that is the general principle of what a reasonable accommodation means. I'm going to jump a little bit. So reasonable accommodation, that also comes with other interactive processes for the determining of that. If a student comes in and needs a specific accommodation, we're required to interact with them included, to better understand what the need is before making that provision. It's not like we see someone with a specific disability and then kind of have a playbook with what we give to them. Like if someone is deaf, we don't automatically assume that they want an interpreter because maybe they've never used an interpreter before. So we want to interact with the individual to better understand what their need is before deciding on a provision. And disability services, that is our responsibility to do that interaction. Every once in a while, a professor will be involved in that as well. Sometimes a student will just themselves decide that they want to talk to a professor to make these decisions. And if they are comfortable with that, we say that is absolutely fine. But if you do need any additional support, we're here for information, we're here for support. And if you do need it officially set up as an accommodation, then that comes through our office. We also require documentation. They need to sign up with our office, and then we kind of take it from there. Providing accommodations also means that we are responsible for making sure that the university is accessible, meaning ramps, meaning automatic doors, meaning elevators. That is also our responsibility to make sure that all of that is accessible for our students on campus. Before we really get into it, we need to discuss disability. What does that even mean? Who do we quote unquote identify as having a disability? Really, what the term meaned in the past to now has changed a lot. After the American with Disabilities Act was set up for the first time, it actually changed again in 2008. They had an addendum. There was the IDEA Act. And then that act expanded on the definition of what disability meant. And that actually became more inclusive and broad of a definition. And it means anyone with a long-term physical or mental, intellectual disability that does cause an impediment to their everyday activity can also be based on attitudinal barriers and environmental barriers. It can be something as, say, simple as to finding an appropriate dietary setup. That can be considered a disability in some environments. If someone has a long-term illness, such as cancer, it can also be considered a disability in some situations. Other ideas from the crowd? Anything from the audience? Maybe let's say something that typically people wouldn't consider a disability, but may actually be a disability. Someone mentioned age. Yes, good point. When I was working with DHS, which is the Department of Human Services, as an advocate, they were making a big push to make sure that ageism was added to those definitions because that can be a high impact and that can cause struggles for people depending on the environment. Sometimes a person will come to our office and say that they don't have a specific disability, but because of their age, it is harder for them to do some specific things. And we discuss that with them to figure out what would be an appropriate accommodation. And there are some things that we don't require documentation for. Some disabilities we do, but other things we don't require documentation for because there are some things where it's very obvious that there should be a provision there and we don't need official documentation. Sure. So I saw another notice, trauma. Absolutely, that can be considered a disability. So I want to talk about that. Someone mentioned like the need for nursing homes. So that would be covered under Title IX. Oh, excuse me, that was the interpreter's mistake, a nursing mom. That would be under Title IX. There's specific support that is provided for that, which might not be through our office, but we do provide additional support for that if needed and if the environment would impose it as a disability. Great ideas. Thank you. Some students may experience a disability in one environment, but in a different environment, it won't be experienced as a disability. So for example, my mom struggles with closed spaces. She's claustrophobic. That will cause her to have breathing trouble. It will cause her to have a very hard time to pretty much do anything within that environment. So if you're in a small environment classroom with no windows, that might be something that is considered a disability within that environment. But a different room that's more open floor planned with windows, it might not be viewed as a disability. Also, the activity might change the definition of what is a disability. Say, for example, if I'm missing a finger, my pinky finger. If I go to a place, say in Japan, and let's use me for an example. I'm very tall. Let's say I go to Japan and I'm trying to sit somewhere that is made for people who are shorter, or I'm going someplace where I need my pinky finger and I need additional support because what I am doing, the activity itself, requires me in order to pick up something. So in Japan, if I'm walking around outside, that might not be considered a disability because I don't need to access seating. So that's connected to social model as well, and I'm going to explain a little bit about the different models as far as disability views go. About 20% of the college population report that they have a disability. For many people, that's a high number. And that also is growing every year. And there's a multitude of reasons why that number does grow. The definition of disability is becoming broader, which is one reason why that number grows. Also, with classes being offered online, there is more diverse options to education, which means more barriers show up based on those diverse environments. In the past, people may not have reported disabilities. Now people are more willing to disclose that they do have a disability as well. So that's another reason that those numbers continually increase. However, from my own experience, the college population that we do serve, we are never serving all of the individuals who do have disabilities. We are actually always serving under the actual percentage of students that have disabilities at college. So for example, at WU, we serve about 70% of the population of students who do have a disability. On campus, there are more than 8% of students that do have disabilities, but we don't serve each individual that does have a disability on campus. As a professor or college administrator, sometimes it can help if you understand 3 different models for perspectives on disability so that you can help be a better service provider. The first model is called the medical model. The medical model heavily focuses on the disability itself. It tries to fix the disability. It tries to solve the disability as a problem. And people with disabilities have had some bad experiences based on that model because it feels like there are so-called cures being forced upon them and they're kind of brushed aside. And it seems like they are trying to be made into quote unquote normal, which does cause a lot of struggle for individuals. People have been through a lot related to that perspective. Maybe someone has a newly acquired disability and they might be fine with the medical model because they haven't experienced that previous history of what that medical model might do. So the medical model itself is not a negative, but it can cause some negatives. Next is the social model. Social model means that we look at the environment and what the barrier is within the environment. So we try to fix that as opposed to trying to quote unquote fix the individual. We'll look at what is in the environment, what can be improved, what modifications might be able to be made. So actually from the audience, what do you think some issues are with the social model possibly? And you can type those into the chat box there. Someone mentioned desks. Okay, desks could be an issue within an environment. Could you expand a little bit more on that, what you meant by that? And if you want to talk as well, I can always spotlight you if you'd prefer that too. Okay, yeah, good point. Yeah, great. Thank you for expanding. Someone else mentioned that the social model does not account for the individual's needs as an individual. Uh-huh. And also as far as seating and furniture goes, that can be a barrier. And I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit later. So great. Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. The size of chairs, chair options. Great. Yeah, thank you. Biases in the classroom. So issues with the social model is it does exclude the person with the disability. We basically ask them to tell us what the barriers are, and then that's the end of their involvement. We go to work on the barriers. They're not really included in the process. So we kind of basically are just looking at the disability, and then we kind of think, okay, well, if we fix it for that disability, then we fixed it for everyone with that disability, which often doesn't work. Individuals who are blind do not have the same life experience as other individuals who are blind. So we can't make something accessible for one individual who is blind and then assume that it's going to be applicable to any student that comes by who is actually blind. So the social model usually is what disability services does. Disability service usually looks at the college environment, wants to make sure that it is accessible for students and faculty. And we also do try to change how we are providing our accommodations because we don't want to just focus on the social model alone. The third option here listed, it is becoming more prevalent within the college sphere, the biopsychosocial model, which means we're trying to look at all of the varying factors. We are including the medical model, we are including the social model, and then we are looking at the impacts of the social model. Some students do better focus when they use medicine and we use the medical model. Sometimes they need to go to the health center at the college and they get medication and that helps them and that's part of their plan. Some students who say have ADD with medication, that does help them. Other services also, the wraparound services like counseling. So a student being able to sit down and express their feelings and discuss those things out. Also calling out other services on campus, the tutoring centers, the writing centers, all of those helping to improve the situation for the student. So we change the system, but we also work with the student. So disability services wants to include all of those different aspects and have exposure to all of those different things. A person might have grown up in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, they do not discuss disability as much. So maybe that person has learned to kind of forge their own way and not show their disability, not ask for services when they come. Then they do come to college and they think, oh, no, no, no. They kind of struggle to disclose that information. They do want access, but they haven't ever used disability services before, so they don't understand the process. So for those accommodations, that's going to be looking very different than someone who grew up in the American school system, possibly had an IEP, had support service providers. So how we go about providing services to those two individuals will be different. And sometimes it's not about what a person can or can't do, but it's about their thought process. If a person has lost both of their legs, they might not be able to run 5 miles, but someone else might be able to run 5 miles. So we don't assume just because that they have one specific thing and they can't or can't. It's often a case of thought process. We can't say, you have no legs and you ran 5 miles. So this other person, we're going to hold them accountable because they should be able to run 5 miles as well. It has to be very individually based. And this is the same as before. Not talking about accommodations. Accommodations meaning a change to make the environment equal for an individual, specifically a person with a disability or a group of specific individuals. Many colleges do provide academic accommodations for students with documented disabilities. The issue is what some of you have already mentioned before. The burden is on the student. So for example, at the beginning, a student has to come in, has to disclose their personal information, has to let us know they have a disability. Other students don't have to disclose personal information about themselves like that. If they don't have documentation, they have to pay to get documentation. And documentation can be expensive. It can be $5,000, $10,000. It depends on the diagnosis. After they get the documentation, they have to come to us because we need more information. We might not understand everything fully, so they have to explain their diagnosis, which can be laborious to them to have to explain everything. Then they go to class, and sometimes to the teacher as well. They need to explain things. Sometimes they don't have to, but they feel it would just go better if they do talk to the professor about it. So it is very burdensome to them, the process itself. Like we were talking about before, chairs as well. So say there's a chair set up as an accommodation. It might be a bright blue chair right set up in the middle of class as an accommodation, which then makes the student stand out. Or if another student who isn't requiring that accommodation sees, ooh, this is a nice blue chair, it looks comfy, I'm going to sit and use it. Then the student who has that as an accommodation sees it and needs to use it. And then maybe the other student says, well, this is a nice chair, I'm going to go ahead and use it, I think I want it. At that point, the student has to disclose that they have a disability in order to get their accommodation. We don't want that type of stuff to happen, but that just shows the extra burden that students with disabilities might face. Yeah, and someone made a comment that that's what they are seeing for students who have disabilities. Absolutely. This does happen often. We do get complaints from students often that will say, like, the teacher took my chair. The accommodation chair is in their office. So we'll ask the professor where the chair is, and they thought, oh, well, it was a nice, comfortable chair. I just thought I'd take it for my office. And then we have to get in there and say, nope, that's actually accommodation. Please put it back in the room. We've also discussed putting labels on chairs. But then again, some students don't like that because then that draws attention to them. They stand out because it is labeled as a chair for disability services. So basically, we put down notes now that say, leave the chair where it's at, don't move it, so that it does set up some rules, but it doesn't out anybody. Also, it depends on the curriculum of a class. Some students have a disability and they're interacting with a professor, and the professor actually has to change the curriculum to accommodate one student. And then if they don't do that, that's an accommodation issue, and then disability services has to go in and talk to the professor. But sometimes professors have had curriculum set up long standing, and it's frustrating to them to have to make those changes. One second. Yeah, Ninja said that it's tough too to get students to advocate for themselves. And to be fair, students going through the K through 12 system might have always had parents being their advocates. So then they arrive to college, it's a completely new experience for themselves. They don't know how to advocate. It's a new concept that they haven't had to face before. So we interact with them. We have to understand where they're coming from, because absolutely that can be tough, that self-advocacy. I always take pleasure in seeing a student when they, first arrive at WU and they're shy, they're not sure. And then by the time they're graduating, they've become a leader and they're like, these are my disabilities. This is what I need. This is the setup that I'm going to have. To see that growth over time is really great. And Tracy said it can be hard for students to get documentation, and asking if there's any other workarounds for that. Unfortunately, in some ways, there aren't really a workaround for that. The law does require that there needs to be some documentation. However, to clarify, the law says that if the disability is very obvious, in those cases, it might not be necessary to get documentation. So if a person comes into the office who's deaf, they're using sign language, and they request an interpreter, we don't ask them for proof. We don't ask them for an audiogram. Also, if a student is struggling to get documentation, we can do a conditional approval for accommodations that will go for 6 months until they have the time to get documentation. Because sometimes students have a new onset disability, and there's a test coming, they need accommodation set up, but it's a long process to get diagnosed. So we can do those provisional things until they get documentation. And Sarah's saying, yes, when they're communicating with students, often discussing the idea of advocating for themselves, but when students arrive to college, they don't know how to do advocation yet. So when doing presentations in high school, a lot of these issues are brought up to try to kind of give them that information beforehand so they know when they're coming that they're ready. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give a 5-minute break and then come back and we'll get going. So for those of you who just arrived, I'm going to take a 5-minute break about each 30 minutes or so. Okay, so 5-minute break. I'll see you soon. So come back at 2:40. Now it's 2:35. We'll start again at 2:40. So I recently talked about accommodations and some weaknesses within that system. Now I want to talk about inclusion. Uh, we are trying to encourage universal design as a focus for universities, meaning that everything is set up as accessible. And someone in the chat had mentioned before that we just want to make sure that all chairs are comfortable for everyone, which is one example of how that can be a universal design. Because, maybe one day someone shows up, they don't have a disability, but they have some specific pain, and it would greatly alleviate that if they were able to use a different chair. And it even could become a disability if they don't have the ability to use that different chair. It could later on become exacerbated and then be a disability. So having that variety of chair option would be something considered universal design. Also, as I said before, inclusion isn't just about inclusion for students with disabilities. It can be people who have experiences with short-term disabilities, with illnesses, with a variety of different things. At WU, we often have students come in, they've been in a car accident and they are struggling being able to use their hands, but it's not considered a disability. It hasn't been going on for over 6 months, which is what we typically ask as clarification for what disability entails. Because of budgeting resources, we're only able to provide provisions for those who have had long-term disabilities, which can be frustrating to students who have that short-term disability. But we often do work with them to figure out what types of support can support them. And sometimes we will also allow them to be served through our office without official documentation. We're not just open to anyone who has any impact of any type, but we do work with those individuals. I wish that universities did have a setup where they could just make everything accessible to anyone who came to them. For inclusion to work, we have to understand marginalized people and what is actually impacting them and what actually does work for them. We can't discuss inclusion without inclusion of the populations we're trying to serve. We also can't discuss inclusion without understanding what works for people without disabilities as well. So it's a two-way conversation. Everyone needs to be involved in it. And the good thing about inclusion is that we can start from scratch and we can build up together what we need. Unfortunately, a lot of colleges, their buildings were established in the 1800s, early 1900s. So oftentimes, colleges or universities have at least one or two buildings that it's just impossible for them to become accessible based on the structure that's set up there. And often those buildings are not used to host class. They move classes out of those buildings into other buildings. But when buildings are being built up new, when there's new curriculums, new programs being designed, that's when universal access should be in mind, making sure that those flexibilities are set up to be inclusive. Inclusive also comes with some pitfalls. Inclusion might mean that a person has a specific need and it might cause more stress on them because more people might think that they don't have a need because they are that one standout and the entire environment is inclusive. So they should also be included, but the environment still might not satisfy every need. We never advertise disability services as a standalone. We typically talk about other resources, and disability services is one of those available resources. So then students have the option to pick through those resources, because some students feel embarrassed to say that they're utilizing disability services. But if you just say something like going to the writing center or going to the tutoring center, then they just think of it as a resource. So we want to be one of those resources. We don't want them to think that it's someone who is in need of help from us. Just we're one of the resources that students can utilize on campus. Did anyone have any comments or questions about any of that so far? Okay. Oh, I saw a message. So Tracy asked if there is a checklist for distance learning environments so that they can make sure that they're not causing barriers in, say, a Zoom environment. A specific checklist I don't have, but we do have lists in the PowerPoint presentation that I will share with you soon based on that, and it talks about things that you can keep in mind when setting up your environment. But there's no exhaustive full list here, but I definitely do discuss that going forward, so sure. Okay, disability services. Many colleges and universities have experienced lawsuits, and the lawsuit is connected to not providing accommodations or access to students with disabilities. Sometimes, as universities are going along their operations, they get sued based on accommodations, and they try their best to make those modifications to provide accommodations to students. There are several situations where those lawsuits have been solved and they haven't become like a gone to court or any fiscal responsibility. But typically, the suing is a way to force the university to make those changes. It's often not about the monetary win, it's about getting the university to set up those accommodations. Some very common accommodations I've listed there, like captions, note taking, extended time. Some others that aren't as common that are coming up often connected to lawsuits. Some students will request unlimited time. So we have to talk with those students and ask what the reasoning is before that, because professors will often say, no, it's impossible for the class dynamics. And sometimes that causes a lawsuit. So we need to talk with those students, and we also need to check and see why it isn't possible and to come up with plans based on that. Sometimes unlimited time could cause more of a burden for the student, so we have to consider that as part of our conversation. Also, flexibility as an accommodation, meaning flexibility with attendance for some students. Some students have a diagnosis that makes it impossible for them sometimes to go to class at all the specific times that are required. So some students are approved to miss at least one additional day compared to what the syllabus provides as missed classes. That is a negotiation between the professor and the student for how many absences the student can have, and that can become contentious. Sometimes the student will ask for one more day and the professor says, absolutely, yeah, one more missed class is no problem. Sometimes the professors say, absolutely not. I've already given students 2 days and that has to work for everybody. But as an accommodation, they're required to give at least one more day. And then, based on that, sometimes it gets people threaten lawsuits. In my position, we have that often come up. The word lawsuit, the threat of lawsuit does come up often, unfortunately. And we have gotten sued a couple of times before, and that was related actually to ESAs, emotional support animals. It can also become contentious when students say, no, one more day is not enough. I need 4 or 5 because of my specific disability. I'm going to need to go to the hospital. I might be laid out for a couple of days. So for them, it makes sense for having several days. But some professors will say, if I give you 4 or 5 days, that's going to be a foundational change to the curriculum for the entire class. So we discussed what that means. What is the foundational curriculum? What would a change like that entail? What does that mean? And sometimes what they say is foundational is actually not a necessary part of the curriculum. And then based on those discussions, sometimes professors say, yeah, once you get out in the real world, this actually isn't a foundational skill and there can be a modification. But sometimes they say, no, this is a foundational skill. We can't change it, or they lose the outcome that we're wanting the students to get. So it's always a very interesting discussion during those negotiations for flexibility. So Mandy said that we don't want to put students in a position where they have to negotiate their accommodations because that can cause a lawsuit. And absolutely 100%. In the past, we have allowed students, at large in the past, but based on that, universities have gotten sued based on that. So things have changed, and now we are the mediaries between that. So we interact with the students, and then we take that information and relay it to professors and back and forth. The final decision does lie with the professor, but if the student is very reticent, we do allow them to appeal that decision, and we listen to that and then can take it back to the university or to the professor. But absolutely, we are the mediary of that negotiation. Oh, nice to meet you, Manny. Another hot topic that's come up recently is ESAs, emotional support animals. That is an animal that a student brings on to campus, but they are not a trained service animal. Those animals are required to stay in the dormitory. They're not allowed into classrooms. Some universities have gone through lawsuits and struggles with this because people want to bring ESAs into classrooms. They need the animal with them in classrooms. I've learned of a couple of universities where they do now allow ESAs to be in classrooms. Other things that come up are students that want more than one ESA, two or three ESAs. They say the cat, if that's their ESA, needs a cat. So that cat needs to have another cat with it, kind of like as an ESA for the cat. So we have to have a discussion of we're providing services for you, not for the animal. So these conversations do come up. And we try to work with them to make sure that we can make the modifications that's appropriate. And we do have some requirements that we talk with them through. And there's a variety of different animals that students want to bring as ESAs. Pigs, snakes. We haven't had many exotic requests. We've had requests for hedgehog and a few other animals, but I do know some universities that have had a variety of different animals that students want to bring onto campus as ESAs. And that's a more in-depth conversation, including sometimes, legal counsel and discussing with the student what's appropriate and not. With lawsuits, the physical things are easier to change. Some of the curricular things are easier to change. However, with stigmas and negative attitudes, those are the hard things to change. Many students are very frustrated with that. Compared to other things you can fix, you can negotiate, but the attitudinal barriers, the disparaging perspectives, those often are the things that frustrate students. The idea of ableism, meaning discrimination based on someone's ability for a student with a disability. There's a lot of discrimination happening connected to that quite often. Ableism is also considered a pandemic. Many people with disabilities all around the world experience this. There's often discrimination which does cause a barrier based on ability. We believe that ableism is more widespread than, say, racism, but actually ableism is part within racism. And the reason I say that, for example, is with racism, it's not just about, someone saying, I look better than this person based on color, or I'm better than this person based on race. It often is connected to, I have more ability than you because of race. You are below me in ability based on appearance. So that is the idea of ableism. And that actually does cause problems for individuals based on that ableism and racism. And those things do systematically cause problems for individuals that can relate to health and can lead to disability. So, what are some attitudinal barriers that can happen at campus? Let's say fear of interacting with a student who has a disability. Sometimes people learn that a person has a disability and they're scared they're going to say the wrong thing. They're scared that someone's going to sue them, so they just don't interact. They just stop communication, which then leads to the person with a disability feeling disenfranchised, and they feel that they are isolated and they don't have the ability to communicate with anyone. Also, stigmas connected to people who have disabilities. Sometimes people will think, oh, you have a disability, oh, you need extra help, or you have a disability, you're not going to be able to pass this class. Another concept is inspiration porn, which means that people are inspired by those who have disabilities. Like for me, as a person who is deaf, I often have people say, "Oh, wow, you're deaf and you have a master's degree and you work and you're married and have kids. How do you do that?" I've had some people that actually want to give me awards just for that. People who say, "You've gone to college. That's amazing. Here's an award for it." And that can be a threat to a person with a disability, that idea that, you must need help from someone, which is unfortunate. And then inferiority, that often will show up in the classroom. Professors will think that because the student has a disability, they need to lower expectations for that student. Or if there's a test, the student will give, or the professor will give less questions to the student with a disability. Sometimes they will give answers, or they will give additional information to the student with a disability. We've seen that sometimes, and then we'll get in there and say, you don't need to do that. We set up accommodations, and then you should be treating the students exactly the same outside of accommodations. But they honestly, some professors do think that they need to lower those expectations. And then if students find out about that, they're very upset, and it can be very frustrating to them. Other barriers: the living setup is not accessible. We will get complaints about that often. Sometimes things are just not set up appropriately, and then students miss out. Also, a lack of communication on campus. If something is happening that's going to impact people with disabilities, we need to make sure that we are communicating that to those populations. So, for example, an elevator. If an elevator breaks down, that can impact many people, say, who use wheelchairs. Some people might think, oh, the wheelchair is broken. That's fine. People can just use the stairs today. But they don't think to let the general population of students know, because maybe someone in a wheelchair has a class on the third floor and they're not going to be able to access it today. Yeah, thank you, Christina. That expectation, people saying the idea that, hey, once you get out there in the real world, and they're not going to be taking care of you like this. They're not going to be able to be providing these types of supports for you. Yes, another attitudinal barrier. That idea that the real world is not able to provide. But there are some laws as well set up for the so-called real world. It might not be the same, right? It might be pressure for the person, but it's different. But unfortunately, yes, that expectation does happen. So now just generalities when we're talking about accessibility. Some things that we already know, but some things that maybe we aren't aware of. Ramps, door sizes need to be 36 inches in width. There needs to be a clear runway in, no bumps so that students can traverse those earlier. Elevators, accessible bathrooms, making sure that the accessibility bathrooms are in buildings where classrooms are. Sometimes there's an accessible bathroom, but it's 2 buildings over. So a student has to leave a classroom. They're not able to utilize the bathroom within the building. They actually have to leave the building, go to another building, and then come back, which means they're going to miss 10 to 20 minutes of class, which is just not great. Lighting as well can sometimes be an issue. Signage, so people know where to go. Sometimes signage or announcements might rely on, say, audio, like at a cafeteria. They might call out the orders. Someone who is deaf can't hear that, and there's no reader boards. Sometimes there's very, elaborate fonts that are not readable. And have those communication aids ready, like interpreters, know where to get an interpreter. Captioning services, know where captioning services is. Make sure you're adding captioning to every video that is you are producing, every video that's available on campus. We do have some videos sometimes that just pop up on campus and somehow they slip through the cracks, and like parents will show up on a visiting day trying to decide what day is best, and they'll like see a video and they'll say, oh, this building doesn't have videos with captions. My kid's not coming here, and kind of like, oh no, we're so sorry about that. That one slipped through the cracks. Think about your front staff individuals. Do they know how to communicate with individuals who have disabilities? That's part of accommodations as well. If they don't know how to access, that can be an attitudinal barrier. So provide those trainings periodically so that people understand how to communicate with various populations. Just make people feel comfortable so that when students come in, they feel comfortable. And also, as a university as a whole, we always encourage activities related to disability or recognizing individuals with disabilities. Recognition of famous individuals who also happen to have disabilities. Bring in speakers who have disabilities. Have people provide workshops. Bring in representation of people with disabilities. We don't want to, I'm not saying bring in a person just with a disability to represent disability services, but we want that as an overall representation of the university as it is part of the population. And if any time you feel the need to leave, you have another meeting, go ahead. I appreciate you coming and thank you. Now I want to talk a little bit about web accessibility. That will be related a little bit to Zoom and also distance learning. Now, obviously, more and more web accessibility is popping up as a need. We have to be aware when we're using PowerPoints, if we're using Moodle or Blackboard. Oftentimes things come up and they're not accessible. Sometimes we will set up, like a really cool multimedia automatic playing video on the background with music. But oftentimes that is not accessible for students who have disabilities. Sometimes they're not able to focus, it's distracting. They don't have the autonomy to stop the animation. The play button is kind of hidden. It's not easily accessible. So they have to search for it to find it, which takes time before they are able to stop it and then get back to it. So if you are going to use those types of things, make sure that it is easily accessible to stop and start. Alternative text. So if a individual is blind and there is, say, a picture, that picture then has a text that will explain what is there visually. PDFs. People often assume that PDFs are accessible, but unfortunately many PDFs don't have alternative formats set up. And also they are, say, scanned from a book and then they are off center, off kilter. So meaning a screen reader won't be able to read it succinctly and will have a lot of errors. Sometimes students will need to use zoom text. So they will try to zoom in on something, but it can be grainy if it's from a PDF. So PDFs are not always accessible. Audio formatting, make sure that the audio is clear. Sometimes, there's a lot of pauses or it's staticky. Captions as well. Sometimes you'll see automatic captions. Sometimes those work great, but often automatic captions have many errors in them. So we encourage people to have manually put in by people captions to make sure that they are accurate and including punctuation. Color contrast, light versus dark. Like, for example, the PowerPoint that I'm using today. The reason that I keep this so simple and basic and plain with just 2 colors and not a lot of pictures in there, it's always nice to have pictures in a PowerPoint, but sometimes that's not accessible for students. So I keep mine plain for that reason. Language as well. The language that we're using, if we're using big jargon, that might be a struggle for people who have word processing disabilities. It might be a struggle for them to read and understand, or it might take them longer. If you have different fonts, that can also cause trouble. So if the typography is more fancy, as it were. Good question. So I'm seeing a question there from Sarah. So ADA does have specific requirements that we always follow as far as sizing goes. That also with rails, there's very specific numbers of, all the sizes for rails as well as ramps. There's ratios of the incline to flat space. So we always make sure that we're following all of the appropriate ones because, you don't want something too high, you don't want something too low. Absolutely. And then Tracy asked if Microsoft Word is more accessible than PDF. Most of the time, yes. Yes, Microsoft Word is much easier to modify as needed as well. People who are colorblind, can that be considered a disability? It can, if the information or education is experiencing a barrier based on the colorblindness. Yes. Good questions. And that last one was from Scott. Okay, let's take another quick break. Let's just take a 3-minute break, and then we will get back into it and finish up to make sure that we have time for you to ask questions as well. All right, 3-minute break. Okay. So someone had mentioned that captions are great for students in general. There is research that says that oftentimes captions are used by a variety of people, not just those who experience a barrier based on hearing. So absolutely, captions benefit a wide variety of people. I'm going to talk about terminology now. Sometimes what we say or what we call a student can cause some distress or trauma for a student. We encourage people to always use the first name if you know it. Same idea as pronouns. We always encourage people to respect individuals' pronouns. Some terminology that we use might not feel appropriate. Like, for example, with the deaf community, we don't use hearing impaired, but some people may decide to use that. So we respect every individual's preference. But that doesn't mean that you apply it to everyone. There are some broad guidelines, but then also if the individual tells you they prefer something different, understand that. And also be aware of some different ableist words. I'll provide some examples here as well that you'll see throughout here. Like, for example, fool, right? That might just be a normal word that people use. Fool, dumb, idiot. Those words have a history of being related to people who have disabilities. And in the past, those have been used to disparage people with disabilities. So that can often be taken as an insult to individuals with disabilities. So we encourage people not to use it. And people use these terminology without meaning anything, but they can cause offense. Also, we encourage people not to make jokes about people's mental ability or reading ability. Like, for example, the recent president, there were a lot of jokes talking about how he can't read, or, he's so dumb, he doesn't think straight. Those types of things can actually be very harmful to individuals who do have disabilities, regardless of who you support as a leader or as a president. But those terminology can be considered bullying. So just something to be aware of. The list of the words there that you see listed below that are generally accepted. People with disability, deaf, hard of hearing. This is sometimes called person first language. Sometimes people will use disability first languages as well, so it does vary. When interacting with people, be mindful that if you offer help, sometimes it can be harmful. Like, for example, if I am sitting at my desk and I see someone coming to the door, I don't assume that that person needs me to open the door for them. I might just wait for them to come in. If I see the person struggling to open the door, I might go, oh, they might need help. So I might go over and offer my help at that point. So sometimes we have a habit of noticing a person with a disability, say someone who uses a wheelchair, and they're coming to a door. We assume, oh, they need my help. So we'll rush over there to open the door. But the person might be thinking to themselves, I can open the door myself. So allow the individual to, figure that out for themselves. If they're struggling, then offer the help. And if they say, yes, please, then go for it. So yeah, we offer that help when we notice a struggle or barrier. We don't just assume that the individual needs the help, like rushing over to open the door for someone, because it's disempowering to that person. Also be aware of microaggressions related to disability. Someone who uses a wheelchair, someone who's blind, maybe asking them questions, like who's someone who's blind, like, hey, can you see this? Can you see that? What about that? Can you see that far? That can be considered inappropriate. I've also already talked about inspiration porn, so that's another thing to keep in mind. Communication varies. People have different style of communication. Some people might have a speech disability, so they might struggle with utterances. They might have a stutter. So we encourage you not to finish their thought for them, like, oh, you mean this, you're trying to say this. Be patient and allow them to consider or to complete their words themselves. If you're interacting with someone who is blind, it's always nice to identify where you are and who you are. Like this is me, I'm a man with this color hair, that basic description. Same thing is on a video, like now Ryan is speaking. And that way people know what's happening because that's what's happening on screen and is defined based on the visual thing. There's also visual descriptions like there's a red background, person named Ryan who has dreaded hair is now presenting. And if you were to introduce a person standing next to you to an individual who is blind, you would give them directional, say a person standing next to me to the right, their name is whatever. Also, don't assume people can read lips who are deaf or hard of hearing. There's a variety of different ways that people communicate who are deaf or hard of hearing. Some people prefer you speaking a little bit louder, but never shout at the person and over articulate everything, assuming that that's what's going to help. So some people have cognitive processing disabilities, so it's going to take them a little time to consider what you said before responding. So be patient, allow them time to respond in their own time. Personal care providers or service care providers, like an interpreter, they are working. So don't go up and talk to the personal care provider and ask them questions about, what do you do? Where'd you learn this? Where are you from? They're actually working at that time, so allow them to do that work. And also don't talk to them as like the parental figure for the group. Sometimes people will kind of talk to them as in, oh, hey, will you tell that student this? Compared to just talking directly to the student and allowing them to do their work. Language access. So if you're using, say, an interpreter, like I said before, know where to get an interpreter. If the individual doesn't use an interpreter, know what other options there are: typing, texting, writing, gesturing. Consider all those avenues and know your toolbox. Some other tips to keep in mind. Physical aids can be considered part of the person's personal space. So if someone is using a wheelchair, that wheelchair is part of their personal space. So touching the wheelchair can feel like you are actually invading someone's personal space. Same idea for an individual who uses a cane. If they set down that cane, don't move the cane because the person will go for the cane and they'll feel that it's lost because it is moved. So respect those personal aids as part of their personal space. And like I said before, ask if someone needs help. If someone does need help, ask how they need help. You don't want to break something because, if you break it, I mean, these 3,000, 4,000, very expensive. Different features that are accessible. Some people might use them. Some people might not use them. They might be for some people with disabilities. They might not be for other people with disabilities. So for example, automatic doors. Push the button, door opens automatically. Sometimes people put trash cans right in front of that door, and then a person with a wheelchair has to try to navigate around the smelly, dirty trash can in order to press the button to get into the door. So we encourage people to remember that these are accessible features that are set up, and make sure that they are functioning and you're not unduly blocking them. Same idea is like a ramp. Sometimes someone will park their bike on a ramp, and then a student who uses a wheelchair isn't able to get past it to enter the building because someone used that as a storage. The accessible stall. Sometimes people don't need the accessible stall, but they think, hey, it's nice, it's bigger, it's more comfortable, I'll just go in there. So a person who needs to use that accessible stall isn't able to use it, and they have to wait. And there, might be an urgent need, and the other person is relaxing in there because it's a nice, big, comfy stall. But it is there as an accessible feature for people who do need to utilize it. Sometimes, unfortunately, when universities do upgrades or they're doing fixing on some property, they focus on the general population, but they don't think about accessible issues. Like, for example, accessible parking areas. Oftentimes, when they're doing some renovation or something, they will place, the big trash cans right in the accessible parking because they think, well, there's a lot of parking all over the parking lot, so we'll just use this area close to where we're doing a renovation. But that's actually accessible parking for a reason. Or it snows and they will clean off the snow, but it will be cleaned off into a spot that is made accessible for people, like a ramp. The ramp is what people use for accessible access into a building. So make sure that those are also cared for. We don't want it to be like, hold on, we'll get to that later. We'll fix the ramp later. We need to focus on this right now. So make sure that accessible features are focused on first as well. That shows that we care about our populations. We're caring for our students, and we're not just leaving them to last. Also, we encourage people to be mindful of medical situations. Sometimes medical situations do happen that are connected to disability. For example, someone who might fall over and have a seizure. It might happen in a classroom. Sometimes people have seizures that are not noticeable. It just looks kind of like they blank out. But make sure that you understand how to provide support. Oftentimes that means calling your local public safety and just kind of minding the area to make sure they're safe. We also encourage you to learn about your university's accessible plan. Oftentimes there is a vision plan for modifications to the university, for upgrades, for accessibility, and make sure that those things are out there in the public and accessed. Make sure that you're aware of what those plans are. Also, put your 2 cents in there to make sure that the accessible plan is actually accessible. Draw attention to things that do need to be fixed or do need to be focused on. As a professor, as an administrator, thinking forward, thinking about the diverse populations that we serve, I've been very impressed with some professors. They will say, we'll give them the heads up that there's a student who's going to be utilizing accommodations, and the faculty member is already on it. They say, hey, I have everything captioned. I have everything alt text. I have everything ready for screen readers. They're ready to go. Their curriculum is already made universally designed. So that's good. From the beginning, from scratch, they're building it up that way. They already have all of that formatting ready to go. So we encourage you, when you are doing any production of curriculum or anything, think about what will be accessible to students and make that from the beginning accessible. And that also includes providing a variety of options for things if something might be a barrier. All right, so I think that's it for now. We have 13 minutes left, so I wanted to leave that time open for questions if there are any questions or any want for discussion. Hello?
I have a question.
Sure. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you have found to be the most difficult part of, and the most inaccessible part of having the Zoom lecture. I'm a lecturer, I teach on Zoom, and just how to make that just more accessible, and just kind of starting with the problem that is, which you have found is the most inaccessible part of Zooming for people with disabilities.
Great. Yes. Thank you for that question. So I can talk about that for me as a deaf person, as an individual. The most accessible part that I'm talking about often is captioning. It's very small. There are apps where you can make it bigger to see it, but for whatever reason in Zoom, it's often very small, and it is what's called running captions. So it's just line after line after line. It just kind of continually refreshes. For me personally, I like when 2 lines pop up and then are refreshed by 2 lines. So that continual running captioning line at the bottom of the screen, that small font, is really not accessible. And as I said before, those automatic captions, there's often a lot of mistakes in those, which is frustrating.
Okay.
For people who use interpreters, when there are many screens in the Zoom call, it's really hard to see where the interpreter is. So we kind of got to say, wait, everybody hold up. I got to find my interpreter. Okay, I found him. Go ahead. So sometimes that's a barrier. We encourage people to take that time, kind of put the hold on stuff, make sure that things are set up before you get going. If you have an individual who is deaf-blind who uses PT for communication, which is protactile, that can be an elongated form, so it can take a little bit of time. So make sure you're building in those pauses too, if those types of accommodations are happening. If a student has a visual barrier, a visual disability, it can be a struggle for them if there's a lot of squares on the page, if they're needing to attend to a lot of different areas in the page. So best for that would be to say, if someone's going to make a comment, kind of pause for a minute, spotlight the person so that everyone has the same eyes on the person. And that way you're not trying to track all over the page to find who is speaking. Those are some
Oh,
things that have recently come up. Other things with technology, let's see. Connected to Zoom, how do you mute? How do you unmute? How do you pull up your screen? How do you turn off your video? When someone comes in, does it automatically move everyone else's pictures around? Sometimes that can cause a lot of frustration for people looking around trying to find what they need. They're just not sure where things have moved and all the bustle. So yeah, it is nice if it's very clear. This person's spotlighted, this person's talking. Now we're on the PowerPoint. Some things are more intuitive to some people, right? Like if you need access to something, click on the three dots. That's intuitive to some. Other people don't know that that's the spot where you find that feature.
okay, great. Thank you.
Absolutely, no problem. I think someone else raised their hand. Let me check. Greg, I think, did Greg raise his hand?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did raise my hand, and there's my dog Delilah. She looks a lot better than I do. So yeah, here I am. Um, no, I just wanted to thank you, Ryan and Peter, for this presentation this afternoon. We haven't done a lot of this here at Lane. And as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, I thought that reaching out to you would be really valuable for not just all of our employees, but particularly for our faculty. And I know that Aaron is on this Zoom call, and I might ask you to come back and do something for us with the faculty specifically, to kind of fine tune some of faculty's abilities to meet the needs of students with disabilities. I can tell you that we have had from time to time an occasion or two where a faculty member really didn't get it. And it made it real difficult on the student as well as the faculty member. But your explanation and the things that you outlined today really, underscored, I think, what a lot of us feel and a lot of us thinking around this. So thank you again. And I also have to thank CM as well. She's going to be presenting next month.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy that you actually brought that up. I would be happy to do that. Absolutely. We do that same thing here at WU. Sometimes faculty feel that they just don't have enough time to focus on accessibility. So they basically just kind of say, just, like, tell me what you need from me so I can get back to my regularly scheduled business, which is just not the focus we want. So we try to find ways to resolve that. We work with the department heads often. So we'll talk with the department heads, and then we'll do, monthly or every once in a while kind of meetings, because, they often have regularly scheduled meetings. And sometimes we ask them, hey, can we show up to your meetings? And we do get the eye roll from faculty at times when we show up to their meetings. But absolutely, yeah, I'd be happy to come back. That's a great point of contact. So yeah, thanks for the kind words as well. And definitely, I appreciate, like you said, that continual development that you're doing at Lane Community. So yeah, Jane mentioned think first before making suggestions. Thinking about different formats, thinking about different options, and listening. Absolutely. Hannah mentioned if we encounter students who are using ableist language, what are your recommendations for speaking to those students? Like class as a whole, teaching them to use appropriate language. Yeah, good question. So full disclosure, ableist language, what people use and what people do use. I always try to avoid telling people what specific language they should use for an individual. For example, say if I notice some ableist language and it impacts me, I can tell them, hey, for me, I don't appreciate that. We can just talk about it this way. But if we're talking about a group of people, I try to avoid saying that language is ableist for a group of people, because I don't want to speak for the entire group of people. I don't want to make a decision, for that entire group of people. So I can talk about kind of what I feel and what I use and what I'm okay with people talking about. But if I am working with, say, a specific student, I can talk about what we encourage at large, what we don't encourage, what might be offensive to people, like the idea of hearing impaired. I use deaf, hard of hearing. I don't use hearing impaired. I don't like it, but there are some people who use hearing impaired, and that's up to them. So if it was just me, if it was an individual talking to me directly, I would say, oh, I don't use that terminology. It can definitely become sticky because we don't want to, say, hey, that's ableist language. But then someone else with a disability might be like, excuse me, I actually use that to define myself. So it can absolutely become kind of sticky. But if you are in a situation where you feel like you kind of want to have a discussion about it and you feel like the group does agree on this specific terminology, then you can talk about it in that way. But, taking into account that variation on preference too is important. And you're welcome to everyone who is saying thank you. I'm very happy to be able to come and present today. And let's see this last one here from Jocelyn. What are some of the ways to help support students who are not receiving enough accommodations as quickly as they need? So for here at WU, we make a big point to always communicate with our students. We will often send out emails, specific times throughout the term, throughout the year, reminders, make sure you're adding your accommodations, registration is soon, make sure you get those in the system. Halfway through, close to midterms, hey, make sure, schedule your midterms with us if you have that accommodation or any additional support. Our doors are always open. We're here. Come and talk with us. We always give them the options. You can call, you can email, you can walk in, make sure that they know all the options to get in contact with us. And sometimes we do check in, just making sure that they know that we're here to support them. Again, making sure that they know if there's any questions, we're here to help. Also, sometimes just letting them know, because sometimes people forget about accommodations, how to use them. Sometimes they struggle on setting them up. So if they're not working for them, if they're struggling with them, we want to make sure they know, come back in, talk with us. We can modify that. We can, go through a training with you. Sometimes students struggle with time management. So we also do some coaching with students. And students have said that they really appreciate that, being able to come in and talk with us. Options for setting up reminders, options for scheduling out their time, just kind of doing some general coaching with them. We listen and then we offer what supports come to mind. Sometimes accommodations don't work for them and they have a better idea of what might work for them, so we can make those modifications. Sometimes colleges will just have a tendency to follow documentation, right? The documentation says extra time, so they set up documentation and that's the end of the discussion. Or excuse me, they set up extra time and that's the end of the discussion. But some students don't even really know until they're there experiencing class. Sometimes they thought, hey, I had extra time in high school, so that'll be great, but college experience is such a different experience in high school. So we want to be flexible. We want to listen to them and we want to problem solve and talk about their options. Sometimes people have the mindset, if we give them one, they're going to want 20. We're not there handing out everything, but we want to work with people. We want to know why they want what they want. We want to have options for them. We're not coming at it from the, if we give them one, they're going to take everything. We want to make sure that we are providing what's adequately going to support the student. Once in a while, we do send out information as well about advocacy for people with disabilities, about inclusion, to staff, to the university in general, because we want to educate the university at large about disability and the community. So I think my time is up. Again, I want to say thank you for everyone. Thank you for coming today. For those who had to leave early, I completely get that. My PowerPoints have already been sent to Tracy, so you can go ahead and review those. And if you do have any questions, feel free to contact Tracy, and then she can feel free to contact me. So again, thank you. I appreciate your attention today. Take care. Thank you.